Let's begin with something deeply misunderstood. The avoidantly attached person is not heartless. They are not incapable of love. But they have learned, often painfully and early in life, that intimacy and safety do not always coexist. And so they retreat, not because they do not care, but because they do not trust. One of the most profound misunderstandings in emotionally imbalanced relationships, especially those between anxious and avoidant individuals, is the idea that emotional presence must always be reciprocal, immediate, or intense. But for the avoidantly attached, intensity often feels like danger, and immediacy can trigger a deep, unconscious fear of losing autonomy. Therefore, if your goal is to reach an avoidance heart, your emotional presence must be consistent, but without demand. This is counterintuitive, for those with an anxious attachment style. The natural instinct is to express feelings clearly, seek reassurance, and move toward connection when insecurity arises. But avoidants interpret this pursuit not as love, but as pressure. When you seek closeness too quickly or too intensely, they perceive it as a threat to their emotional boundaries. It's not that your emotions are inherently wrong, it's that their nervous system isn't wired to process emotional intensity without feeling like they're losing control. So what does it mean to offer emotional presence without demand? It means learning to hold space for connection rather than chase it. It means being emotionally available, but not emotionally expectant. You show that you're capable of connection, you remain open, kind, and grounded, but you remove the emotional urgency that so often suffocates the avoidant psyche. In practice, this might look like not over-explaining your feelings, not asking for constant reassurance, and not interpreting their silence as rejection. Instead, you demonstrate that your emotional reality is stable and doesn't rely on their immediate response. Avoidants are hyper-attuned to expectations. They're deeply sensitive to the unspoken pressure to perform emotionally. So when your presence comes without that pressure, when you show up authentically without trying to pull something from them, they begin to feel safer. Your emotional consistency, not your emotional intensity, is what earns their trust. This doesn't mean suppressing your needs. It means learning to express them from a place of self-worth rather than emotional dependency. It means being honest about your boundaries and feelings, but doing so in a way that communicates, I can handle my own emotions. I invite you to meet me here, but I don't need you to validate me in order for me to be okay. Offering presence without demand also communicates high emotional intelligence. It tells the avoidant partner, often subconsciously, that you're someone who understands the complex dance between autonomy and intimacy. You're not trying to consume them. You're offering connection as a gift, not as a transaction. In the end, avoidants move toward what feels safe. And safety for them isn't silence, it's space. When you master the art of emotional availability without emotional pressure, you become the calm in their psychological storm. And it's in that calm, not in pursuit, not in pleading, that they begin to feel something rare, the desire to connect on their own terms. Self-containment, in the context of attachment dynamics, is not about emotional suppression or isolation. It's about emotional sovereignty. And in relationships involving avoidantly attached individuals, self-containment becomes not only powerful, but magnetic. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to anything that feels like a threat to their autonomy. And the anxious partner's instinct to pursue, though rooted in love and longing, is often misinterpreted as an attempt to control. In contrast, the emotionally self-contained individual exudes a kind of internal stability that the avoidant unconsciously respects, even if they don't yet understand why. When you're self-contained, you signal a powerful message. I am enough on my own. I want connection, but I don't require it to validate my existence. That stance alone is often what shifts the avoidance internal calculation. They've spent their lives expecting others to need them too much or fear losing them too deeply. And when you don't do either, it confuses their expectations and disrupts their usual psychological defenses. Avoidants equate neediness with entrapment. They've been conditioned to guard their emotional space because at some point, closeness became associated with a loss of freedom or identity. So, when you act from a place of self-containment, when you don't text to get a reaction, don't share your feelings to elicit sympathy, don't chase after silence with explanation, you become the one person in their life who doesn't try to pull at their boundaries. And that, paradoxically, is what draws them in. Self-containment doesn't mean with emotionally. It means being centered in your own value system. It's the discipline of knowing that your peace isn't something others create for you. You live with purpose, you pursue goals, you process your emotions with maturity, you hold your own frame. And this kind of internal structure stands out to the avoidant because it contrasts with the chaos they often associate with intimacy. Pursuit creates pressure. It activates the avoidance instinct to escape, to retreat, to build walls. But when you shift your energy inward, when you stop chasing answers, closure, or emotional performance, you create space. And in that space, the avoidant has room to miss you. This isn't a manipulation tactic. It's an emotional recalibration. It's you reclaiming your power without making the avoidant wrong for their wounds. It's you saying, I respect your need for space and I won't violate it, but I won't abandon myself to maintain a connection that costs me my peace. Ironically, it's your distance, grounded in dignity rather than resentment, that allows the avoidant to reapproach you. And when they do, they'll find not someone who needs them to be whole, but someone who is already whole and is simply open to connection. That difference changes everything, because avoidants don't chase chaos, they chase calm. And when you become emotionally self-contained, you stop being a pursuer and start becoming the emotional anchor they never knew they were seeking. Respecting an avoidance autonomy is not a passive act of withdrawal, it's an active demonstration of emotional intelligence. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, closeness can feel like a threat to independence. They crave connection like anyone else, but they often associate intimacy with the loss of control, identity, or safety. The moment they sense that their space is being encroached upon, their instinct isn't to lean in, it's to pull back. This is where most partners get it wrong. They chase, explain, argue, or prove. But ironically, it's when you stop trying to change or fix them and instead honor their boundaries without judgment that they begin to trust. Trust in the avoidant psyche is earned through space. Not silence, not indifference, but space with presence. This means you don't abandon the relationship emotionally, but you also don't invade. You let them come toward you when they're ready. And when they do, you don't punish them for their delay. That posture of patience, not passivity, is what creates a new emotional dynamic. By respecting their autonomy, you're signaling, you are free here. I do not need to control you to feel safe. That's a revolutionary message to someone who has spent their life fearing that closeness will cost them their freedom. In fact, many avoidants test early partners specifically to see whether they'll honor that autonomy or try to override it. When you don't bite the hook, when you hold your center and allow them room to breathe, they begin to experience a relationship that feels safe, not suffocating. This doesn't mean accepting emotional neglect or staying quiet about your needs. It means learning to express your needs without demanding immediate emotional labor from someone who is still learning how to stay emotionally present. Respecting autonomy isn't about shrinking your voice. It's about choosing the right moment and tone to use it. It's about understanding the difference between being emotionally honest and being emotionally urgent. Urgency triggers defense, clarity fosters connection. Most importantly, respecting their autonomy forces them to take accountability for their own emotional process. When you're not there to soothe every insecurity or overfunction during conflict, they begin to see the relational impact of their distance, and that discomfort is necessary for growth. They can no longer blame the anxious partner for being too much, because now in the quiet they have to face the reality that they may have been not enough. Over time, this respect for autonomy doesn't push the avoidant further away, it draws them closer. They begin to trust that your presence is not a threat, but a sanctuary. And from that place of safety, the avoidant can finally take the risk they've been afraid of all along, real vulnerability. Because when you stop demanding trust and start modeling it, you create the conditions in which it can naturally emerge. And for the avoidant, that shift can be the difference between fear and connection. As someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional chaos often feels safer than stability. They've built their internal world around the belief that dependence is dangerous, that consistency is a trap, and that closeness always precedes loss or suffocation. So they move through relationships with a subconscious need to maintain distance, to protect themselves from vulnerability by keeping others emotionally at bay. But here's the paradox. In the long run, it's not drama or distance that keeps their attention. It's stability. Quiet, unwavering, self-possessed stability. When you show up as emotionally consistent, not reactive, not needy, not pushing for more than they can give, you become a reference point in their psychological storm. While they may not trust love that's loud or love that pursues, they eventually begin to trust the kind of love that simply is. Your emotional stability becomes the thing they cannot find in themselves, and in time, it creates a subtle gravitational pull. Avoidants tend to provoke emotional reactions, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, as a way of testing the safety of intimacy. If you lose your center, when they pull away, they internalize that as confirmation that closeness always leads to chaos. That when you remain grounded, when you respond instead of react, when you let the storm pass without trying to fix it or chase it down, they start to recalibrate their understanding of emotional connection. This doesn't mean tolerating neglect or suppressing your own emotional truth. Rather, it means that your emotional responses are intentional. You express your feelings without spiraling. You communicate your needs without ultimatums. And you remain solid, not because you're suppressing your pain, but because you're rooted in your own self-worth. That sense of self, not performance or persuasion, is what makes you magnetic to the avoidant over time. The truth is, avoidants often feel like emotional imposters in relationships. They may want love deeply, but they're terrified they won't be able to sustain it. Or worse, that if someone sees their emotional dysfunction, they'll leave. When you remain steady, not to please them, but because you've done the inner work, they begin to believe that maybe they don't have to run. Maybe someone can witness their imperfection without punishing them for it. Eventually, your emotional calmness challenges their default patterns. It forces them to sit with their discomfort instead of blaming it on your need for closeness. And in that stillness, in that mirror you hold up by being consistently grounded, they begin to ask different questions. Not how do I escape this, but what would it feel like to stay? And in that question lies the foundation of transformation. Because when your energy is calm, self-contained, and non-reactive, you don't chase the avoidant. You lead them home to themselves, not through pressure, not through persuasion, but through presence. That's what makes your stability not just attractive, but necessary. It's the one thing they can't find in fleeting excitement or emotional distance, and the one thing that in time they may finally risk reaching for. Non-reactive communication is one of the most powerful tools you can use when dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. It acts as a psychological invitation, not a demand, not a plea, but a signal of emotional safety. Avoidants are hypersensitive to emotional intensity, especially when that intensity is directed at them in the form of need, frustration, or expectations. They interpret high emotion as pressure, and pressure for them is a threat, so they withdraw, shut down, or disappear altogether. When you communicate non-reactively, you bypass that defense system. You're not trying to convince them of your worth or explain why their behavior hurt you in dramatic, emotionally charged terms. Instead, you're showing them something they rarely experience, a space where emotion exists but does not overwhelm, where boundaries are firm but not punishing, and where you speak your truth without trying to control their reaction. This doesn't mean you become robotic or emotionally detached. On the contrary, non-reactive communication is deeply emotional. It just isn't chaotic. It's grounded in self-awareness. It's speaking not from fear, but from clarity. You might say, I felt hurt when you didn't respond, not to shame them, but simply to share your internal experience. And then you stop there. You don't spiral, you don't chase, you don't escalate. That restraint, that centeredness is powerful. Avoidants are not drawn to emotional perfection. They are drawn to emotional safety, though they often don't recognize it consciously. When you model that safety in your communication, you give them a chance to stay in the interaction without triggering their need to escape. You become someone who can handle emotion without making it dangerous. That's rare and to an avoidant. It's quietly magnetic. The beauty of non-reactive communication is that it creates space for reflection. It doesn't demand a particular response. It allows the avoidant to sit with what was said on their own time without feeling cornered. That space, free of emotional clutter, is where their clarity begins to form. You're not trying to force a connection. You're showing them what healthy emotional intimacy looks like, and they begin to sense that being close to you doesn't mean losing themselves. Over time, this way of communicating shifts the emotional landscape. It subtly reprograms their internal associations. Instead of linking intimacy with enmeshment, they start to associate it with calm, maturity, and choice. And that's what opens the door, not to instant commitment, but to real consideration. When you speak without reacting, when you respond from a place of self-possession rather than emotional hunger, you stop playing the role of the pursuer. Instead, you become an anchor in their emotional chaos. And in that stillness, in that quiet but firm emotional presence, you extend an invitation not to chase you, but to meet you where you are, grounded, whole, and waiting for nothing but the truth. The path to intimacy, particularly with an avoidant partner, is not paved with manipulation or calculated moves. It is forged through emotional integrity. While many are tempted to use tactics or psychological strategies to win back someone who has pulled away, this only reinforces the very fears the avoidant is trying to escape: inauthenticity, pressure, and emotional enmeshment. What truly reaches them, what has the power to transform the dynamic, is a consistent demonstration of emotional truth without the need to control outcomes. Emotional integrity means being deeply honest about your feelings, your boundaries, and your needs without using them as leverage. It's not about pretending to be indifferent to get a reaction, nor is it about oversharing to force closeness. It's about aligning your inner emotional reality with your outer behavior, regardless of what the other person chooses to do. This kind of integrity is rare, and it's powerful, especially to someone who is wired to expect emotional entrapment or volatility in close relationships. Avoidants are often suspicious of closeness, not because they don't want it, but because they've been conditioned to believe that closeness will cost them their autonomy or overwhelm them with responsibility. When you act from emotional integrity, you defy that expectation. You show them that intimacy doesn't have to mean sacrifice or self-betrayal. You show them that a person can feel deeply without becoming emotionally chaotic, that love can be offered without strings, and that vulnerability can coexist with boundaries. This doesn't mean you tolerate poor treatment. On the contrary, emotional integrity includes the willingness to walk away from dynamics that are harmful or depleting, but you do so from a place of self-respect, not revenge. You're not trying to teach them a lesson by disappearing. You're choosing your own well-being while staying rooted in your truth. That clarity, not coldness, is what ultimately shifts the relational dynamic. When someone sees that you will not betray yourself to earn their affection, it subtly reorients the emotional balance. You stop being the pursuer. You become the mirror that reflects their own emotional limitations, not by shaming them, but simply by staying grounded in your own. Over time, this kind of presence becomes impossible to ignore. It lingers, it invites reflection, and it often becomes the very thing they return to, precisely because it was never about chasing them to begin with. Emotional integrity also gives you freedom. You are no longer performing or strategizing to gain validation. You are living in alignment with who you are, and that internal congruence becomes magnetic. It frees you from the roller coaster of anxious hope and despair, and it offers the avoidant something they rarely encounter: connection without entrapment, care without control, and depth without dependency. The path to real intimacy, especially with someone who fears it, is not through games or distance. It is through a quiet, powerful authenticity that says, "This is who I am. I don't need to chase you to prove my worth. I simply stand here, whole and true."